Okay. So, Phil, you've been working at this city for a while. Can you tell me what year you started working here and what your background prior to starting to work for the city of Portland was with regard to planning zoning?
Sure. I started working with the city in 1999 and actually started working in the planning and zoning section down in the development review, what was called Office of Planning Development Review, OPDR. So I started off by reviewing permits and things like that. And I stayed down there from 99 until towards the end of 2003, and then I moved up to planning, but worked chiefly on zoning code stuff through regulatory improvement and also helping out with other code writing projects. But prior to that, I worked for a couple of years for the city of San Jose, and prior to that, I actually did a lot of other non-planning work. I worked for the Yellow Pages.
Yeah. So, so that brings up a question. Just a background question for me, which is, you are part of an association, the American Planning Association, or you're a member. Is there any actual prerequisites or qualifications that, in general, planning zoning staff at cities across the country are required to have, or is it kind of just like a hodgepodge of different qualifications that people tend to bring to the table?
Well, I mean, generally, most folks that get hired, and it can differ between public and private sector as well. Public sector, they're usually looking for folks who have a background, either a degree in planning, whether it's bachelor's, which there aren't that many, or a master's. Mm-hmm. A lot of times people will get a undergraduate degree in something else, and they'll look at their master's in planning or public administration or something like that. And so oftentimes I think when you look at the requirements for planning jobs in the public sector, they're usually either looking for that master's degree or a combination of experience with some other kind of degree that could make up for that. I may be different between jurisdictions, but I know when I was working at the city of San Jose and also working here, the jurisdiction itself, our jurisdiction, doesn't necessarily require you or persuade you to become a certified planner. Mm-hmm. But the American Planning Association does have a test that you do. Mm-hmm. It's called the AICP, American Institute of Certified Planners. And in private practice, there's a lot of times where people will get hired and the company might say, great, and in 2 years we'd like you to take the test and become certified or something along those lines. So there is, I think that then it's a little more of a marketing tool. It's also some of the things that you review for that are things like planning ethics, things like that.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to go into history of ADUs. It's going to get we're going to go like ancient history, mid-history, and then early history as in 1991 and beyond, so just so you know what's coming. All right, so tell me about the early history of ADUs in Portland to the best of your knowledge. Start as far back as you feel comfortable, but let's talk about the early 1900s and how restrictive or non-restrictive zoning rules were about adding secondary housing units on single-family lots at that time.
So, well, and I was just looking through the binder, and I probably would have to get back to you on some of the more specifics, but the city of Portland didn't have a zoning code until 1924, which is, I think, that if you look at the city of New York being kind of one of the first ones, I think they were only 1916 or something like that. So there really weren't a lot of zoning codes created until that time frame. And that was sort of, the birth of Euclidean zoning and limiting the uses. What I saw back then is it did kind of still carve the city up into zones, one family zone, multifamily zone, a commercial zone, and a heavy industrial zone. And what I kind of saw in looking just today over some of the code real briefly, I probably have to follow up with you, is it did appear that there was some limitations even with the early codes in the one family zone of having, say, a second unit. There was an allowance I saw in some cases to go through a conditional use review, they called it, to allow other, even multi-dwelling in those cases, or other things like churches and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But it does appear that the city did have, some restrictions on that. Like we just kind of saw there, some history of the Portland zoning code makes it sound like we zoned quite a lot of the area of Portland to have multi-dwelling, so then maybe there wasn't a concern in those areas if you had a house to build a second unit, they just didn't look at it. But I would have to go back and see when we started using the term accessory rental unit, as its own. I see stuff about guest houses and things like that.
Yeah.
And they even talk about, guest houses for use of, living in them. But sometime, I think probably in the 70s or 80s is when we probably started using the term accessory rental unit. Maybe that's when we started maybe providing some allowance for them.
Yeah.
But 91 was the code when we rewrote the code and then kind of consolidated all those regulations into the base zones.
Yeah, it seems like the definitions of ADUs have continued to change over time, I guess, with these development regulations, but there's this core idea that a secondary unit is comprised, or the unique facets of a secondary unit in Portland under its current code are a kitchen sink and a stove connection. I wonder whether that was the core distinguishing feature prior to 91, or did they not really care about that? I wonder what their understanding of a secondary unit was prior to these codes.
And I don't know if there was a difference between zoning code and building code too. That's where you kind of run those kind of parallel codes that may address things differently. I mean, we kind of go along with the building code idea of this, if it provides independent sort of, cooking, bathing, and sleeping facilities, it's considered a unit. I think that comes probably more out of the building code.
Right.
But whether somebody in the 70s was building a pool house and, stuck a full kitchen and a bathroom in there and then and then a rec room, if we would have said, oh, we're going to call that an accessory rental unit, I don't know if we had that kind of terminology that solidified back then.
Got it. Right. Whereas now, if you did go that far, you would have to classify it as an ADU. So going back to kind of mid-history, tell me about ADUs to the best of your knowledge before and surely after World War II. About you can and maybe talk about that in the relationship between Euclidean zoning and the tightening of zoning laws pertaining to multifamily housing in residential zones.
Well, I think, once again, what might have happened is, and I'd have to go through the different zoning, but it appears that maybe we had some limit, even back then we had some limitations in the single dwelling zones. And maybe the case was more that, and you probably can kind of see it in places like the Buckman neighborhood and so on, where you get a real mix of, the closer in neighborhoods where there's still a lot of older Victorians and other turn-of-the-century homes, but then interspersed are a whole bunch of apartment buildings, sixplexes and things like that, or conversions. And I think part of that might have been because, we may have had code language that said in a single dwelling zone you couldn't have another unit, but we had that whole area was zoned for multi-dwelling, and so then it didn't matter. So part of it might have been a mapping thing, and part of it might have been a code piece. So I know there was sort of, as people started to kind of gain interest in the older homes and older neighborhoods, there was a pushback to downzone a lot of areas. So there's a lot of areas that got more restrictive zone colors or zone map changes. So there are a lot of parts of Buckman that maybe were just all intended for what would be the equivalent of like an R2 zone, which would be, on a 5,000 or 6,000 square foot lot could be a duplex or triplex. A lot of those areas may have been downzoned back to R5 or back to R2.5, or the equivalent back then, and then a lot of apartment buildings would then just be a non-conforming development. So there's that. I do think that a lot of zoning got much more restrictive and more kind of regimented after World War II, and it also exploded in terms of jurisdiction. And this is not so much Portland, but just I think overall, I think a lot of jurisdictions really started using the tool of zoning to help control where they grew or separate out the land uses or make sure that, this subdivision wasn't, placed right next to a factory and things like that.
And so even residential, though it's not a different form of use of that zone, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe it is defined as different use, but distinguishing between multifamily and single residential zones would have been part of that whole Euclidean zoning movement that happened, and this was in the 50s, is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Euclidean zoning started with, that was the initial zoning code, so it just, from the 20s up to through the 50s. I think it went through, but we mentioned on the phone, I think like with Portland, during the World War II, we did this war code housing where we kind of allowed some houses to be chopped up or people to rent other rooms and things like that. But, I think with the suburban kind of expansion, what happened in a lot of cases was this really desire of home ownership and neighborhoods of home ownership, and the difference between tenements and everybody renting versus everybody having their own kind of piece of land. I think that was probably more a case of and the financial structure, how people got loans. People probably couldn't get loans to build another unit on the lot anyways. So there probably all that kind of was geared towards, single dwelling only, home, and I think the zoning kind of followed that.
Okay. So let's go into more recent history of ADU development in Portland, and I'll be kind of adding an appendix that's derived from, your appendix here of the recent history of ADUs. But could you elaborate on any recollection you have about ADU development in the 90s in terms of the adoption of ADUs? Like there was the code changes, and then what was the actual reality of the reaction to those code changes, if any?
Well, I think, and we actually have on our website, I don't know if you've come across, Mark Bello he had both a report that went to the Planning Commission, I think 2003, but it kind of did a snapshot of ADU development 97, 98, and 98, 99, I think. And a little summary, and then have some of the case studies in another volume. But what he was looking at kind of provides a bit of a snapshot in the 90s. I think, originally the idea was that an ADU could only be an internal conversion. And that was that whole accessory rental piece. Whether it was a basement or converting your bonus room in your house or whatever. And, the first kind of thought with that A overlay, which was being applied in areas that, like the Albina Plan area, that were at the time not developing real significantly, and the thought was providing more flexibility, and maybe if they can get 2 units or things like that, there was a lot of things that were added to this A overlay that was supposed to help spur development. One of them was expanding what was then a pretty restrictive accessory rental unit thing, so that you could also potentially add on to the house and so on. It didn't allow the detaches, through all our stuff until later. But and then as that got expanded to other parts of the city, it got expanded to detached. But that didn't really. I think it still required owner occupancy, which was what the accessory rental unit required too, and also had some other requirements. And it wasn't until we, that 97, 98 timeframe, I think they were effective early 98, where we started allowing, just in more general cases citywide, the detached ADU, or to build a house with an ADU and things like that. I think the A overlay might have changed where you could build a house with an ADU in 96, but that was right before it. But all the stuff with the A overlay, like on the survey that Mark did with his report, is he had problems just finding ADUs that were built into the A overlay, and in a lot of cases when they were, because we had an owner occupancy requirement, but we didn't have a size limitation. A lot of developers were just building essentially a duplex.
Yeah.
And then nobody was calling him on it if they were using it as a complete rental property.
Right.
So, and even though we didn't have that, and when he was looking the first couple of years that we had opened up the ADU chapter. So he's looking at kind of 98, 99, and there definitely was a little bit of a jump in ADUs, at least according to, it was more than I realized. I mean, I think over a couple periods, we went up to having, 80, he reviewed 80 permits. I think they had to do with ADUs over that time period. So it was definitely more than it had been before that, although it pales in comparison to what's been happening the last 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But his experience with that was he realized that when we did limit like the size of it and other things at the time, the limitation was 33% of the size of the house. But even though we didn't have a requirement that they be owner occupied, that more of those were owner occupied than the ones in the A overlay where we did have the owner occupancy requirement. So he felt that kind of limiting the size and so on was potentially more of a incentive for it was somebody who was going to live in the main house normally and then rent that, or use it for a family friend or something. But there definitely was an increase, but the thing that really changed it, I think the thing is the kind of barrier to ADU development has been, it's two things. It was regulations and it was the cost, the fees. And I think, regulations have been getting less and less. They've still been more regulated than other structures and other development potentially. But, I think we saw the regulation, easing the regulations created minor little steps. But, taking in the SDC fees created, a much more monumental step. I mean, going from 30 a year to 40 or 50 a year is probably what the regulations did. And then taking the fees to, the 50 a year up to now, 300 a year. That and the economy probably too.
So, we'll get back to the SDC in 1 second, but do you think, and I guess you've kind of said this, but just to make sure, do you think that any of these regulatory changes that happened between 91 and 2010 resulted in greater adoption of ADUs? And if not, what value did these changes add?
I mean, I think they added value, but I think it was sort of like chipping at the ice block. They chipped away at the ice block, but then I think the SDC fees is what just shattered that ice. I think if we hadn't done those regulations, I mean, if it was still owner occupied, only an internal conversion, existing house had to be 1,400 square feet, and I can't remember some of the other older ones. And we said we're going to waive the SDC fees. I don't think we'd be seeing near the number we're seeing now. Or we'd still start seeing this sort of weird guest house structure or whatever that is not considered an ADU.
So it's a kind of a combination in your mind between both the regulatory relaxation of regulations and the removal of these proportionally high development fees.
Right, because I think I was looking at through that ADU program guide that we released. I think the current version, because I was looking at how it was being edited and it was kind of confusing on the SDC fees, but I think the current version, it had a little blurb about SDC fees are being waived, but then it still listed what historically they had been. And I think, for example, transportation, I don't know if they charged an SDC fee if you were doing an internal conversion. So I think there were some situations where doing an ADU under the kind of the old regulations probably resulted in a lower fee. But obviously there was still a much greater kind of demand for doing these detached or at least new construction ADUs.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like this is going off tangent here, but it seems my understanding is that roughly 1/3 are detached new construction, roughly 1/3 are garage conversion or garage plus ADU iterations, and roughly 1/3 are basement conversions. Is that commensurate with your take?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, usually the garage conversion is gonna have some element of, it's essentially a new accessory,
Yeah.
detached structure, because there's
Yeah.
usually some element of expansion or rebuild.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would, there's probably an element of it that is also some other internal or expansion of the existing house. And there's probably a greater percentage now that are, more recently, I think there's probably a greater percentage of new houses. Maybe you would chip away at some of those percentages and maybe you could say, 10% of them are a new house with a new ADU. I would have to kind of take a look and see, but our permits are not always real good at tracking that. Because obviously, if somebody's building a new house and it happens to have an ADU, it's not going to show up as an ADU permit because it's a new house.
Right.
But kind of anecdotally, I think there has been a larger increase compared to say before the recession when people were building new homes. I think there's probably a higher percentage of new homes that have ADUs in them than there had been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially because SDCs don't apply still. I think that's
Right.
a big-
Yeah. So it's clear that the STC waiver has had a significant impact on the development of ADUs. If the STC waiver were to lapse at this point, given that ADUs have kind of taken off, and let's take the tax issue out of the equation. If the STC waiver were to lapse, what impact do you think that would have on ADU development at this point in Portland? This is a somewhat political question, but it's more, I'm going to use this more as background information than a quote.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, for me, it's a personal opinion. I think they would probably, they'd go back down to like 1/3 of the level they're currently at.
Mhm.
That's kind of what I think. So, they wouldn't go back down to the 50 or so we were averaging a year, but maybe they go back down to 100 per year.
Mm-hmm.
And what's going to kind of depends on if there's some sort of midpoint for some of these different bureaus in terms of what they charge for the fees. I didn't realize, I hadn't really spent a lot of time looking at SDCs, so when I was kind of looking at the program guide, I didn't realize like PBOT seemed to not charge for, they charge for a detached ADU, but not necessarily a conversion. So I didn't realize was the case. I'm still not 100% sure, but so there's some uncertainty on all that. But I do think that they would cut into it quite a bit, and you'd probably see a lot more of the art studios and the guest houses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna change tracks here. As a staff person who sits at the desk answering questions at times, what difference do you notice between the questions of those who are asking about ADUs versus the other kinds of questions that you get while working at the planning desk, if any?
Well, I think, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I think one thing that's interesting, this is more from a historic, because I did permit review and had counter shifts for quite a while, and then actually when I was still up in planning, I still had a weekly counter shift until, I don't know, sometime after the whole crash, and maybe until 2008 or something, and then didn't until a year or so, maybe a year and a half ago. And one thing I've noticed, this is more in general, about people asking questions about their property is before people just kind of had maybe an idea and they want to know what to do, and now they're coming in and they want to maximize. And one thing I have noticed is, especially as a person who basically deals mostly with questions, not just reviewing permits down there, the questions often seem to be pushed, how can they push the envelope?
City completely closes down the first day that the accessory structures project.
It's a conspiracy.
Oh my gosh.
So, in the past, I don't think that, like the idea of the 800 square feet maybe wasn't, it might be an issue if they wanted to work like with a basement conversion, that's what they have, but if they're building a separate structure, it maybe wasn't as big of a deal, and now everything's like, how do I do that? I want to do 800 square feet, I want to do this.
You're saying that that's
so
more
that
of
also
an,
applies to, I think, the ADU, but it, just in general, what I've seen is, like in our multi-dwelling zones, it used to be, people were saying, well, I really just wanna build a duplex on this lot. You'd be like, well, you have to build 3 units or whatever. You have to build 3 to 6 units, and they'd be like, I just wanna build a duplex. Now people are coming in and saying, well, I wanna build 8. So that kind of mindset kind of seems to be also kind of applying, maybe not as much with accessory ADUs, because usually you deal more with homeowners and things like that. But you still, there's this sense of like maximizing their return, just in general with the questions. And I do see it trickle into the ADUs that I didn't seem to be the case as much.
okay.
So that's why the issue, like with tiny houses and things like that,
Yeah.
does seem to go again. I mean, you also have people come in and are really interested in doing a tiny house. Or really, I really don't want to deal with this. I'd like to be able to just have my 120 square foot. Why do I have to go? So you get that, but a lot of it is, and that's why you were getting ADUs that had, the winged dormers and things like that, because it's like, how do I make the 18 feet but still get that full 2 floors? Because I'm not satisfied with just the sleeping loft up there. I need 2 bedrooms and a bath up there. So I do kind of see. I think that is something that's kind of grown with that. And whether it's a case of because just construction costs are that much more, and like you've said in the past, if you have to factor in a kitchen, fixed cost for a kitchen, fixed cost for a bathroom, fixed cost for the permitting fees in general, and materials, and then the incremental costs of doing 600 square feet versus 800 square feet are pretty small, then you're gonna, but the rental rates, probably are not quite the same proportion. You're probably going to push the 800 square foot.
So and I think what you're kind of picking up on seems like it would more correlate to the general economy of Portland and housing issues. I guess my question was about this specific, if any, there might not be an answer to this, but I'm just curious, is there any kind of way to distinguish the forms of the questions or the types of people that are coming to ask the questions for ADUs versus all other, say, residential projects, or is there no really clear distinction?
Not so much, because I think some of the issues that come up with the ADUs and some of the kind of things like the idea that, hey, I've got a garage in my backyard, that should mean I have like a grandfathered rights to something. Those kind of things will also apply to other kind of questions about a fence or questions about other things. And so I don't think it changes that much. I think the issues with ADUs is because we've gotten fewer, we've kind of lightened up on the regulations a little bit over the years, in addition, and then now this project lightened it up some more, but since the regulations have gotten a little more liberal, I think some of the back and forth that sometimes happens with, why can't I do this with my property, is probably lessened a little bit. I think especially allowing like square footage up to 75% instead of the 33%. I think the 33% was really a real barrier, because if somebody said, hey, my house is small, I have 1,100 square feet of living area, and you're like, okay, you get a 360 square foot of ADU, it really favored a bigger house. So I think there was, because there was, and you couldn't necessarily point and say, well, the 33% is a good reason because, it was something that somebody came up with many years ago, and if there was a good reason, it's kind of not become common knowledge anymore. And so I think there were certain things in ADUs that maybe people felt didn't make sense, and they were only applying to ADUs and didn't apply to like other types of development. And so removing some of those, maybe over time have aligned ADUs so that the questions are a little bit more similar, and there isn't, or there isn't as much of this pushback. Whereas before people were kind of saying, why does my ADU have to be limited this way when I can do other stuff? I mean, there's still other, those kind of things. But yeah, I think the thing that's probably changed is just the volume of ADU questions. And I don't know if I'm really answering your question. Though,
No, no, that's fine.
Yeah, the volume is, I mean, one thing I noticed in the last year and a half or so, going down there and answering questions versus before I was doing it, is, and they didn't used to split it up where somebody's a question person, somebody else is a permit person. They kind of just, everybody was doing intake or whatever. But, you'd have your share of questions, and you'd occasionally get a question about an ADU, but, it wasn't something that people really brought up. And now, especially if I'm focused on questions, I mean, there's times when I've had every other question during my shift is an ADU question. So, I mean, I think there's just kind of interest and awareness of that has gone way up compared to what it was.
What are the initial kinds of planning and zoning issues, obstacles, and problems that come up commonly for homeowners who are trying to develop ADUs on their property?
Probably, the location of it. Can they use an existing structure like the garage? Size sometimes can be an issue, especially if they're trying to do things like convert the basement. Sometimes the issues with the materials and some of those design standards that apply to ADUs. We'll see if those are less so. But those are kind of the ones that come up. They usually people have been able to work with them better than maybe they used to. But you do get situations where, and also the phasing sometimes. There's been situations where, especially with like the design piece, they're going to renovate the whole property, and they want to build the ADU to live in, and get that permit done first, and then they're going to redo the house to match, and they're going to eventually use all the same materials. But, right now the house is, asbestos shingles and this and that, and this kind of a pitch roof, and they don't want that with the ADU because they're going to change the house eventually. So there's been a few questions that come up with that way, just in terms of phasing.
But the first one you mentioned was location, and by that I assume that you're talking about referring to setback issues and relationship to other structures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, most people want to put them in the back, but it's just like the side and the rear setbacks, and and also sometimes how far back it is behind the house and things like that.
Okay. Before, besides the SDC waiver, what factors do you believe have helped ADUs to become a viable and popular form of project for homeowners in Portland recently, besides the SDC?
Well, I think some of the regulatory changes helped. I mean, I know there's probably, and even with our code way back when, we may have required a second parking space for that unit. And so, not requiring parking for it has helped. I think like loosening up, allowing the detached and things like that, those regulatory changes have been made over time, and allowing up to 75%. Made it more attractive for people to do. But I think, the other thing is I just think there's also been sort of a culture shift in this idea of, what do you use your yard for and what do you use your property for? And before the idea was, the backyard was only used for your own personal enjoyment. You built your deck or you built your pool or if you built some structure, it was just for you to store things. And I think people are now starting to think of, well, if it's for me, it's going to be for my home office, or it's going to be for, renting out or things like that. So people, and maybe it's because housing costs have gotten to be such a large percentage that, somebody's home is no longer just their sanctuary. It is an asset that they have to bank against.
Yeah, it would be interesting to understand what the proportional value of the equity position that an individual has in 1920, 50, and 80, and 2015 is, It might be that the home is a proportionally larger asset than it used to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so the loosening of restrictions is one thing. Is there any other, and then just, I guess the economics that you referred to, is there any other variables or factors in Portland that, because I had mentioned, it's my understanding, with the exception of Vancouver, British Columbia, in North America, but not in the United States, Portland has the most active ADU development program anywhere.
Right. And I'm not sure if, it's interesting because this report that Mark Bello had at the end of it had some kind of recommendations, or had a conclusion thing and some recommendations. I don't know if you've actually found that on our regulatory improvement site, but it might be worth just scanning through.
Yeah, I'll look for it.
I can send you the link. But, one of the things it mentioned was looking at things like SDCs and so on. But it also talked about doing things like, promoting them, having somebody in ONI work to get the word out about these as an alternative housing option and things like that. And I don't think we've done any real advertising other than, the people downstairs creating these program guides and things about to help aid somebody who's already interested in building one. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that, and I don't know if it's the fact that just from being kind of silent on them or essentially being complicit in allowing them, where so many other jurisdictions actively disallow them and even have programs probably stamp them out a little bit, or used to probably more, that maybe it just by not being so anti them that by default we got to,
right.
to be good on them.
Well, I think what you're saying is probably right. It's more just like the relaxing of restrictions and the economy. Like if the relaxing of restrictions had taken place, which it did prior to 2000, I don't know that we would have seen a lot of ADUs. But it's just that the timing of things are such that right now it's like the obvious economic choice in many cases.
I don't know, yeah, because if you looked at what were the SDC fees, I don't remember, I was reviewing stuff in 2000, but I don't really remember how much SDC fees were things. I mean, they were still a pretty big chunk, but they've gone up quite a bit. So,
Yeah.
Maybe that big of a barrier back then, I don't know.
All right, so what advice would you offer to other planning and zoning departments that are considering how to induce more ADU development?
Well, I think, from a regulatory standpoint, I think looking at your regulations and easing them, and I think getting beyond the fear factor on that. One of the things I was surprised with the accessory structures project was, I actually went back and was pulling the ADU project from 97, 98, and I was actually going into our electronic e-files, which is what the city clerk records. So it's all the testimony and everything. And the amount of testimony that came out, it was a case where probably if the city council had said, well, we're going to vote how the majority of the neighborhoods think, it wouldn't have passed. The testimony was just, don't commercialize our single dwelling name. It sounded very much like that kind of mindset of the single dwelling house, that this is our sanctuary, our backyard is our sanctuary. We don't want somebody else living next to our backyard, kind of thing. And that was, the testimony was time and both individuals and a lot of the neighborhood associations and so on. And so I think that at the time the city council went beyond that and said, no, we think this is a good thing. I don't know where it came from or who was leading that charge, and whether there was another jurisdiction we were looking to as saying to help point the way, but obviously kind of made a stand and said, let's do this. And so I think we got over that fear, kind of lightened up the regulations a little bit. That's part of the reason why the A overlay still had their regulations. A lot of people said, we agreed to these regulations only a couple of years ago, and you're going to, get rid of them already, and we don't want you to. So they kind of left those, but they, got more liberal on all the citywide stuff. But, and the world didn't end, so, and people kind of forgot about it. So I think it's kind of that, from a regulatory standpoint, getting over that fear. I don't think, if we were having to do that all over again in this age of short-term rentals and Airbnb, I could see, probably that blowing up again, and then the question would have to be asked, should we still do this with the idea that, a certain percentage are going to be used for short-term rentals, which, once again, when we were doing the short-term rentals, we were getting that same kind of testimony, don't commercialize our single-dwelling zones, don't turn them into hotels, yada, yada. But I think there's that regulatory standpoint, and then but the fees are really important. I mean, I think you probably know more than anybody about, if somebody's budgeting, whether this is doable, and especially if it's not the easiest thing to get loans, I think it's probably gotten better. But if you're tacking on something that adds, I don't know what the SDCs would add, but if it's adding 15-20% of the cost, that could easily make it cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
So I think I think the idea of taking out the fees is a big thing, and whether they all have to happen at the same time, we didn't do it that way, but.
So, and you alluded to there being an owner occupancy requirement. When did that dissipate or disappear? Is it 98?
So it disappeared in '98 for the general access ADU stuff. It was still there in the A overlay. And so that's why then that little report that was done looked at it. But in the areas of the A overlay that had the owner occupancy requirement, they also had no size limitation. So that's
mishmash.
Yeah, so it was a case. I mean, there weren't many that he was able to look at. I just looked at the report, but I think out of 80-some ADUs that he reviewed, just in the base zones, not in the A overlay, like 6 of them weren't owner occupied. So some very small percent. That might be different now. But then in the A overlay, he only had, I think, 14 that he could look at, and 5 of the 14 were not owner occupied. So I mean, it's still a minority, but it was definitely 33% instead of 8% or whatever the other one would be. So owner occupancy is, I mean, once again, I think that gets back to the kind of that old style, that old sense of what a single dwelling or single family neighborhood should be, is that everybody owns their own home. And doesn't, there aren't rentals, but that's hard to control. And it's hard to verify owner occupancy, especially in a big city.
Discretionary versus by right development. I'm kind of like, one of the things that I believe is the case elsewhere is some form of a discretionary conditional review. And I don't even know what that process would look like. I've never been through it. You must know from Portland and from San Jose what that looks like. But I imagine that towns that have a conditional discretionary review in place, that would limit ADU development to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, then it adds an extra layer. It's a review process. I mean, if you're asking for a discretionary review is, I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody to get an adjustment to something. I mean, that's a smaller version of a discretionary review.
Yeah.
And but it's still a case where the neighbors are notified. There's often potential to appeal the decision, things like that. And so it adds that level of uncertainty, which is what discretion means. In our case, in the city of Portland, when there's a discretionary review, the applicant has to, write up a, list of short paper or list of answers to a question of how the project meets, the approval criteria, basically. They vary depending on what the review is. But then somebody can challenge that.
An example of approval criteria is light and air privacy protection for neighbors, that kind of thing.
Right. Or, better, like with our adjustment process, because you're asking to kind of waive a regulation or modify it, those approval criteria are things like, equally or better meets the purpose of that regulation, or it doesn't detract from the neighborhood and things like that. And so those things, depending on the review and the jurisdiction, some discretionary reviews might not be appealable, they might, you know, or sometimes what happens is in some jurisdictions, it's a staff level review, and then if there's an appeal or something, it goes to a hearing, you know, or it goes to, you know, some other body that reviews it. But it can add, yeah, it can add time, it can add expense. I mean, even our adjustment reviews now are, you know, unless it's a fence or something like that, which is the lowest cost, but, you know, adjustment to the height or to the setback standards is $2,000.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I think, and, you know, it adds, and it also potentially gets, you know, it could get the neighborhood involved in a bad way, because it's, if, you know, if the neighborhood's uninformed, or they're not, you know, they just don't know about the impacts, you know, then they start making their own conclusions on that. And if they, you know, with Portland, we have a fairly formal system where, you know, if you as a neighbor want to appeal something, you have to have a stake in the game, you have to actually pay an appeal fee. But if you get your neighborhood association to vote and agree to appeal something, then there's no fee. And then essentially the neighborhood association is the one doing the appeal. But it does, yeah, I think the thing with the by right piece is, you know, the idea is you should probably, you know, come up with regulations and purpose and stuff that address some of these issues up front, and you kind of say, hey, if those things are met, then you can do this just through a permit.
And that's called by right, or is there a term for that?
Yeah, I mean, you can call it by right, or, you know, straight to permit, or,
Okay.
yeah.
This is maybe getting political, so you don't have to answer if you want. But what constraints, if any, should a city consider for allowable uses of a property that has an ADU? By that I mean allowable uses, meaning many cities have an owner occupancy requirement. That's kind of where I'm getting at. And also the Airbnb issue is now sprouting up both in Portland, Santa Cruz, and Austin. So those are the two specifics I'm thinking about.
Well, I think the owner, and I'm just a time check.
Yeah, sorry.
So no,
Sorry.
not for me. I don't know if you want to go to that.
I do,
Yeah.
but
You know, I think owner occupancy requirement, I guess if there's some way that you can monitor that and control it, and you think that's a good thing, you can consider it. But once again, you know, I don't know if owner occupancy requirements, you know, accept sort of the changing nature of how people own and rent property nowadays. I suppose if you have an owner occupancy requirement, since you're there, then you might keep the property up better. You might have ground rules that control the person living in the ADU, or if you're living in the ADU, control the person living in the house. But you know, from a regulatory standpoint, you know, if we had an owner occupancy requirement and somebody complained, you know, our code compliance person's going to go look, and they're just going to say, well, I don't know, is the mailing address for this property the same as the property? If
Yeah,
it's
I
not,
mean,
you know, I guess I'll have to send a letter to the owner in Bend, you know.
yeah. And I even have broader questions about the constitutionality of having an owner occupancy requirement for one form of development, when I don't know are there any examples of any other forms of housing where there's an owner occupancy requirement for duplexes or triplexes or anything?
Yeah, well, I'd have to look. I mean, there probably are CC&Rs and stuff that have been set up, you know, which are more
For
private
HOAs,
agreements.
yeah.
For HOAs that say you can't rent out your house to it, you know, or things like that. But,
Right.
But whether you should have a regulatory, you know,
Yeah.
a citywide or region, area-wide. Yeah, so I don't know, you know, as far as the Airbnb, I mean, we're grappling a little bit with accessory structures. I don't have you know, I'm not sure either way. I mean, I just didn't want to necessarily mess with it, but, you know, the issue of home occupations and you know, ADUs and, you know, versus short-term rentals. I mean, we didn't really want to open up that sort of discussion, but at some point we probably will have to, about because we've had somebody moved into a new house that had an ADU built into it, and they wanted to move their home occupation into their new house, which was an occupation, they were tutored or something, where they had, well, because they had an ADU, they technically had moved into an untenable situation. They technically couldn't run, even though they weren't actually expecting to, they were gonna use the ADU as their place to tutor, or they weren't gonna rent it out. But, so I don't know if we're gonna have to kind of look at that again. But, at the same time, it's kind of acknowledging this, sanctity of the single dwelling neighborhood and how many extra things can you do. And we kind of said, okay, you can choose, you can have a home occupation, you can have a short-term rental, you can have an ADU that's part of that short-term rental, but you can't have, all three. And so, I don't know if that's the right direction, but that's where we are, and that's kind of that, along those same lines.
Yeah.
And Steve Novick, wants to not have short-term rentals and detached ADUs. But
Detached?
I think he was more focused on I don't know if he was just on ADUs. I thought he was more focused on the detached ADUs, but.
Okay, what special issues, if any, do ADUs bring up that other residential improvement projects do not bring up?
Well, I guess, there's probably a perception, and I don't know if it's justified, but, I think some people have a perception of it, increased livability impacts because they think somebody's living there as opposed to using, if you're talking about detached structures, as opposed to somebody using that structure for a storage building or just, their sort of rec room or workshop or whatever. I think people sometimes get a little more freaked out about, somebody's living in their backyard.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if that's, something that, haven't been studies that have said that really is the case or not. I haven't really heard of that. We haven't seen a lot of code compliance cases.
Yeah.
With short-term rentals, I think what comes up, and it wouldn't really be specific to ADUs, the short-term rental thing with things like noise and so on is especially when you're renting on a short-term basis, pretty much, and you're in an area that is a place where people are vacationing, then, everybody's visiting is essentially in vacation mode, and so I can see the situation of, every weekend's a party there versus a few times a year kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I don't know if, as far as, other types of development, I think, when we took this project out with the district coalition offices and neighborhood associations that we talked to, although Fritz kind of came up with different conclusions, maybe she worded it differently. I didn't go to her open house, but when we brought this forward about creating more flexibility, allowing possibly some more smaller ADUs to be up to the proper line, we really didn't get much of a response, and I got the sense a lot of it depends on probably what the issue of the day is, and most of those district coalition offices are dealing with the fact that somebody's complaining to them about the 3-story house, the home that got torn down and the 2 3-story houses that are getting built in their place, and so I think there's right now there's probably more of a concern about just overall infill, so that the ADU has not been that big of a deal. A few years ago, everybody was concerned about the cell towers in their neighborhood. So.
Last question is, so many cities have regulations that make it difficult to develop ADUs. Portland does allow ADUs, but what is the city's position, what would be the city's position on whether to allow for basements to be used effectively as secondary units, with the exception of the dedicated kitchen sink and stove connection, i.e., you can basically make a basement into a secondary unit in any city, anywhere in this country legally, with the exception of a kitchen sink and a stove. So is there anything problematic about that?
Mean about having like a nationwide kind of provision about turning basements into living space?
Not a nationwide.
Whether it would have and you're saying that and they wouldn't have a kitchen?
I'm saying,
One
of the pieces of advice I'm going to offer in this book is your city doesn't allow you to do ADUs, well, you can still do an ADU, you just can't add a legal kitchen sink or a legal stove, as the case might be in your city. Is there any, does that advice raise any red flags from a regulatory perspective?
From a zoning standpoint, I don't think it necessarily raises any red flags. There might be some building code requirements, the whole issue about, which we deal with here with basement, finishing basements is, is the window big enough for somebody to get out?
Right.
Is it the right level? They have the headroom, that kind of stuff. And I don't know if there's other jurisdictions that say you can't necessarily finish a basement.
Yeah.
There's also just the issue, some areas probably have more issues with mold and moisture and things like that in those areas.
So it's really a building code issue.
Yeah, I don't think, and I don't know if there's other zoning code, maybe there's zoning code issues about, and this is where I used to know more about how, I used to be more global in my knowledge, but it's like I've gotten so focused on Portland lately, I lost track of some things, but there may be things where, certain jurisdictions may regulate their height or things like that based upon number of stories and things I mean, Portland used to do that. And maybe they would say, well, if it's an unfinished space, if you park your car in the bottom part and the rest is unfinished, we're not gonna count that as a story, so you can have 2 stories, but if you finish it, we're gonna call it a 3-story structure. I don't know, there may be some issues with that kind of stuff. I don't know, it'd be something that you'd have to kind of look at. But,
Okay.
Whether they look at finished space, for square footage, if there's limitations on the size of something, whether turning it into square footage could have an effect.
Yeah.
I know, the residential infill project, one of the things they're, toying around with the idea of, because people want us to clamp down on things, is maybe instead of having a building coverage and a height limitation, maybe we still have a building coverage and a height limitation, but we also put a FAR. So maybe, or maybe we're not as concerned about the building coverage piece. So if somebody wants to build a sprawling ranch that's 1 story, they could maybe cover more of the lot. If they're gonna build 3 stories, then they're gonna have to have a smaller footprint. They haven't come up with any kind, but they're kind of playing with these ideas because, I think what people have been upset about is the structures, both from a footprint standpoint, may be bigger than what was there, and it's, an extra story taller than what was there too.
Right.
I mean, I don't even know if other jurisdictions, if it's the kitchen that is really, triggering
What
the issue
triggers
or
the
not,
definition? Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed San Francisco it was New York, there was this article about how they just, approved one of their first micro apartments because they had a limit on, a dwelling unit had to be at least 400 square feet. So they actually, I think for this one unit, this one building, they reduced that requirement. But, they're gonna experiment with that, but.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's in their development code or zoning code or building code, but.
Well, thanks.
So, yeah, and, if you have more questions.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. I'm not sure what else will come up.